We are now going to move on to our only three-way fireside chat. So moderated by our favorite Kenn Cukier from The Economist, who's a New York Times best published author, has an amazing podcast on big data, and is working on a new book as a fellow of the Said Institute in Oxford. And joining him is Ian Hogarth, who was the founder and CEO of Songkick, which is used by hundreds of millions of people to find amazing concerts. And he's since been doing a lot of investing and thinking in machine learning, specifically along Ai Nationalism. I think some of you might have read his fantastic piece that he wrote a couple of weeks ago that has hit the top of Hacker News. So with that, get a few chairs.
And we've got a third panelist.
Oh yeah, and then I'll just hang out for good measure.
Does everyone know Nathan? What we wanted to do right now was to look at the state of AI in 2018 and sort of give not just a summary, but maybe a critical synthesis of what's been going on. And there's maybe 4 domains that we want to hit, 4 areas. The first one, I'll give you a flight path of where I think we're going to go, although who knows when the panel starts. The first is on research. The second one is on business. The third is on politics, and the fourth is on predictions for the year ahead. Let's start with research. What's been interesting on the lab bench this year that you see sort of showing a lot of promise?
Well, I think some of our speakers have done an amazing appraisal of that to date. But I think one of the biggest things was sort of the very elegant design of the new AlphaGo system, and the fact that you could learn very complex behaviors in a simulation entirely from scratch in self-play. And I think that went way beyond what the production system was in Korea. And that was more recently followed up by OpenAI in Dodo 2, which is a bit more complex of an environment, partially observable, multi-agent systems. And so I think that's super promising. The work that Shakir was talking about in generative modeling, I think, is also very inspiring. This idea that you can discover entirely new ways of creating materials or creating chemicals for pharmaceutical industries, and that idea of trying to supercharge human creativity is something that I'm very excited about, and I think is more on the fringe of applicable research than purely pie in the sky. So I think those 2 are areas for me that I like.
Ian, what do you add?
Well, so I guess part of the context of this is that Nathan and I have spent the last couple of months sort of working on an overview of the most interesting things that we've seen in machine learning and AI over the last year. And I think we've spent quite a bit of time in that report digging into hardware, transfer learning, kind of scene understanding and world models, and then, as Nathan said, the kind of the various breakthroughs in deep reinforcement learning.
So far, there's the large web platforms have been creating a war on talent for AI and creating monopolies of the mind, for so to speak. But we haven't actually seen that translated into practice, with only a few sort of exceptions. Maybe voice has become really a dominant area. Driving, automotive has been a dominant area. Do you see the competition now that the dust is never settling in AI, but that these monopolies of the mind are sprouting up, these empires of AI? I'm thinking of Amazon, Baidu, Google, Facebook. Where are they going to go with it? Where do you see sort of a commercial battle brewing in areas that we haven't seen it yet so far?
I don't know. It sort of feels like how long is a piece of string?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that the area that I think everybody's very mindful of is the framework war, which clearly Google took a lot of air out of the room with the release of TensorFlow, and that's done amazingly successfully. And then we've got other fantastic frameworks like Keras that are out there too. But I think from the startup angle, there's still a lot of uncertainty, as was pointed out by a friend who was looking at our report, that startups are not sure what frameworks to pick, because technical debt is a big issue in the future, especially when you're working in a space that's evolving very quickly, when the performance of your product expands very quickly with data. And so that kind of uncertainty, I think, is very unsettling. There's clearly a big war also towards distributing cloud services to everybody, and one of the slides we have here is sort of like taking the building blocks of intelligence and the senses, like seeing, reading, feeling, we're not quite there yet, but and then wrapping these as an API and exposing it to as many people as possible. And so we kind of see that as, again, one of the few steps towards big tech companies actually seeping into more and more industries that they might not have traditionally been tackling.
I think one of the more interesting things for me is the sort of the number of different fronts that the larger technology companies are progressing on in parallel. So we have an interesting statistic in the report that shows that the number of papers accepted ICML has roughly doubled in terms of the percentage from Google and DeepMind. So you've got this huge contribution to the research community from these platforms. You've also got them expanding into commercial domains that historically one wouldn't really have thought of these companies as kind of being interested in. I mean, self-driving cars is kind of the obvious one. And then I think that while in the sort of English-speaking kind of internet, there are sort of key sort of differences. For example, Amazon's investing far more in robotics, I would argue, than Apple or Google or Facebook. But in China, I think there's a lot more sort of multi-dimensional competition between Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent. They've all sort of got initiatives in all the key areas, and it's sort of this like hyper-competitive, multi-dimensional competition.
There is a concentration of power in AI commercially. There's a concentration of power geographically. That doesn't seem like it's going to abet because of natural forces, or will it? Will the ecosystem and rough and tumble of startups and universities be able to end the spread of AI, create a market-based solution that will create a balance of power? Or will regulators need to step in either in terms of antitrust or some other mechanism at the commercial level, and then question mark at the political level? So power.
Where do we start on that one?
Yeah.
But everyone, you can't laugh because I'm about to poll the audience in a second about this, okay? So watch out.
Yeah, this probably covers, I think, a third of the report. I mean, I just presented some very high-level figures from it in the intro slide, but we've seen CIFIS coming in and investigating foreign acquisitions, and it's sort of interesting to see like the number of companies that were bought by Chinese entities sort of growing, and in 2017 when nationalism really hit the stage in the US, that figure just gets compressed like crazy. So we're really seeing protectionism.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how it's going to get any better if there's not some kind of.
Yeah, I think it's very nuanced. I mean, you've obviously got you've got increasing use of, I think, borders, for want of a better word, in this domain. So in the most recent China 2030 plan, there's an explicit point in there about all kind of data that is moved across the Chinese border into another country has to be reviewed. There's this interesting example of Zimbabwe, where a startup based in China, CloudWalk, is now exporting sort of face and video data from Zimbabwe to China to train CloudWalk's kind of image recognition system, selling that back as a service to the Zimbabwe state.
Surveillance as a service?
Yeah.
SaaS?
Yeah. And this is all part of the much more sort of Belt and Road Initiative of the Chinese state. So I think I think borders are going to become a bigger deal. Germany tried to block the 4.5 billion euro acquisition of KUKA. There's definitely a sort of
the traditional value of liberalism wants open borders and free markets. On the other hand, in a world of populism and growing authoritarianism, maybe this is actually the appropriate response to be more careful and to actually close the borders and close the markets. Who here thinks that it's actually a good thing for there to be this AI nationalism? We're going to talk about government funding in a moment, but sort of an AI nationalism is a good thing versus this sort of destroys the solidarity of science as we've known it. Good thing, raise your hand. Come on, surveillance as a service, okay. Destroys the fundamental solidarity of science that's borderless, raise your hand. Well, it looks like it's about 86.3% of you. All right. Let's switch to funding, which I think is stunning that we have the UK talking a big game but not writing any checks. China, which is sort of on a juggernaut, as it always is. It has the scale, but it's just really put wads of cash on the table. And America, asleep at the switch, missing in action. How does the story end?
I mean, I would personally argue that we're sort of in a situation sort of analogous to kind of other sort of dual use or omni-use technologies of the past, like oil or nuclear, where we've kind of we had a phase where the startup ecosystem was almost the sort of the prime mover. I mean, I think that what what Demis and Shane did with DeepMind to sort of almost reignite the sort of the momentum around sort of AGI research was then followed by all of the major technology companies redefining themselves as AI companies. And I think that McKinsey estimates they're spending something like $20 to $30 billion a year collectively on kind of machine learning related things, including acquisitions. But I think that those figures, let's say 50 million or $1 billion in funding for small startups once upon a time to huge amounts of large multinational technology company funding. I think the next stage of that is a sort of order of magnitude more funding, and that funding will come from states. And the analogies there are with I mean, just taking the example of the defence budget spend for the UK. I mean, it's a £45 billion spend. So if any states move beyond the sort of the early steps that China and the UK and South Korea and America have taken in state-sponsored AI investments, then the amount of money entering the sector will increase by an order of magnitude.
Ethan, you're nodding, but I kind of want to know where...
We've left out France in the discussion.
I did. They,
deliberately?
And the UAE, which has a minister of AI.
I didn't know that.
Who knew? Exactly, who knew? And France, I mean, you can't get your back without being a mathematics genius. I mean, everyone should be doing AI.
True, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you can't step through the London Tube without seeing ads calling French people home, so.
Is the AI? What is the negatives of the AI nationalism? It looks if this is this the new space race? And are we going to be talking about missile gaps and AI gaps? Should we embrace all the funding? Should we be wary?
I mean, I think the scariest thing for me is when there ends up being an extractive relationship between either a country and another country, or a technology company and another country. And I think that maybe the positives of some of this nationalism is that it will allow smaller countries to have to sort of play defense in a way where N years from now, when there are sort of international negotiations taking place, those smaller countries like France or South Korea or Zimbabwe have more of a seat at the table. That can be viewed as a constructive positive.
Kai-Fu Lee of Cineventures, but formerly Google and Microsoft, is coming out with a new book in September called Superpowers, or AI Superpowers. And what he does is he basically takes the traditional balance of power from, you could argue, the 18th century, but also certainly the 20th century, and he layers it onto the world of AI. And he comes to many very fascinating conclusions, that all of Silicon Valley is snowflakes, that China's going to eat everyone's lunch, but more importantly, that you're going to have two pillars of AI, and it's going to be China and America. And everyone, just as you had the first world and the second world, and you have the third world in the 20th century development world, third world meant you were the unaligned nations. We then used it to refer to developing countries and the poor. But he believes there's this new era of neo-colonialism that is going to emerge, in which every country has to align with either the US and the AI systems developed in the US, or China and the AI systems developed in China. So you have SAS in Zimbabwe, surveillance as a service, and it's going to be with China. Authoritarian states love authoritarian states. and Europe is going to be a vassal, all the European democracies, to the pillar of America. Is this wrong? I'm going to poll everyone here. Who here thinks it's right and who here thinks it's wrong? Raise your hand if you think that. In fact, we're entering a new era of AI colonialism in which you're going to have these two poles. Europe is going to be nowhere. And in effect, it's not going to be nowhere, but in effect, countries are going to have to choose to align themselves with one pole of AI or another, or they're going to lose out on all the efficiency gains of AI. Who thinks that we are in an era in effect of colonialism versus not at all? Colonialism, raise your hand. AI colonialism. Okay, no, seriously, that looks like it's basically about maybe 15, 20%, because there's going to be a lot of not sures, unknowns. Who here thinks that's completely daft? Ain't going to happen. Raise your hand. Definitely a majority, but it's maybe not quite 2 to 1, 1.5 to 1, and the rest don't know or rather not say. Raise your hand. Yes, okay, that's right. So it's not quite balanced. Most people think it's daft. What do you guys think?
I think these things are always a little bit hard to foresee without, I mean, I think a good example of this is kind of, the sort of strange dynamics of how nation states move. So a classic example would be that, in the kind of the relatively early days of atomic physics, and there's this, Leo Szilard, is basically petitioning the U.S. government to build an atomic bomb, and is trying to assemble various other distinguished physicists to assist him in that petition, and he basically gets kind of roundly ignored by everybody. And then a few years later, you have the US spending $25 billion in today's money, hiring 100,000 people, and building industrial capacity on the scale of the US automotive industry with the Manhattan Project, and that all happened in the space of a few years. So obviously that's wartime. It's nuclear technology has been far more used for destructive purposes and constructive purposes, net and that.
Should AI researchers believe that they have an ethical responsibility not to participate in the militarization of AI?
I think with any omni-use technology, it's pretty hard to argue that you're not if you're in the technology. Yeah. It's like, what's stopping the DoD using a bunch of research output?
I mean, there was already evidence towards that end with a lot of brand name researchers signing agreements saying that we're going to ensure that we're not going to contribute towards this, but to some degree, I don't know if you want to get onto predictions at some point, but it's not unreasonable to think that if certain research groups actually start becoming quite close to producing technology that could be repurposed for other uses, there's sort of a moral imperative to say, well, is there more value towards releasing this as open source for everybody, or do we actually think about conserving that to ourselves and not exposing it because we don't control the action of other actors?
Well, one of your predictions, indeed, is the idea that a major research facility will go dark because of the potential misuse of its research that it then decides to self-censor and not release.
Yeah, I mean, if you look in the OpenAI charter, they explicitly, signal that, there is a risk that they will be forced to sort of cease sharing as much research in the public domain due to fears of, misuse of the research by rogue states or authoritarian regimes.
I mean, there was an example, I think, in the press last year or something about new multi-agent systems research, and then as soon as that was published, there was a press tagline about the Chinese government running a conference specifically on multi-agent systems as it applies to military use cases.
Okay. We have not that much time left, and we have a lot of people, I'm sure, with questions. Why don't we try to collect several comments or questions, as succinct as you can make it, and then we'll let you give a chance to sort of make an omnibus response. So I see one question here, one over there, and one we start with, and a third there. So let's go in that order, please.
Thanks. Hi, it's Alex from Amadeus. A lot of what's just been said applies equally, I think, to the cybersecurity domain. So I'd just be interested to hear if guys would like to say how you think it differs from the cybersecurity domain.
Great. Why don't we pass the mic? There. I think the gentleman's behind you. Thanks. And then we'll go to the third there.
Hi, Steve Crossan. The difference, I think, between AI and, for example, nuclear is that it's very hard to imagine controlling AI research. I think it's easier to imagine controlling the application of AI research through distribution, which is why the big guys have a lot of power, and the Chinese state, for example, has a lot of power. But it's very hard to imagine that ideas will stay contained for very long. I'd be interested in your comment.
Okay. Gentleman here.
Hi, Otso from Valheim. So, talking about the state of AI, it's developing at a huge speed right now. So, how does an individual like me or you actually stay up to date on the state of AI?
There's a report. Any other? I see a question right here. Question or comment there.
Martin, Filament AI. Do you think there's this argument about saving, keeping the bad people from getting some research on AI is actually going to be used for big organizations to silo their research?
Great. There's a gentleman here. And if there's any other questions, if not, I see there's a third. That'll be the final question. Great.
Quillen from King's College London. So I think there are two aspects, right? The first aspect is the AI methods, the algorithms, whatever. The other aspect is the data. And so when you talk about siloing and all that, perhaps you could comment on these two things.
Great. Good. I'll go ahead. And please.
Okay. Thank you. My turn. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Chen from UCL. So basically, one thing I once talked with my friend majoring in politics is something like the social inequality and AI. And I wonder if you have any specific comments for this, because so there's one maybe not very common smartness, but I believe it to be true, is AI might enhance the social inequality, because it's the first time that even professional, skilled individuals will face the risk to lose their job. This never happened before. So do you have any specific comment for that? Yeah.
Okay, good.
60 seconds.
Yeah, you both have 30 seconds with which to respond to every single question. But I ask you to do it in 25. No. There's a lot there. You probably can't answer every question, but what are the one or two common themes that you could sort of summarize in a final statement?
Well, I firstly I'd say on the state of how you sort of stay abreast of things, that's sort of why we wrote this, because I think that it is important to synthesize research, the sort of commercial applications, the political implications, and the talent sort of aspects of this entire space. And so it's very challenging for any one person to do that. And so we've sort of attempted just to basically collate all the coolest things we've seen in the last year. I think on the inequality, there's a whole section on where we present two specific surveys that look into this. And in general, social attitudes around inequality are the public broadly expects things to get worse in many, many ways. Practically, when you look at the economic, kind of macroeconomic analysis, there's very little exact evidence pointing to that right now, but a lot of sort of gut intuition on the behalf of citizens. What were some others?
Well, cybersecurity, I think.
Cybersecurity. I mean, I think that machine learning is kind of a force multiplier on the economy more broadly, and I think certainly it'll sort of have a huge relationship to offensive and defensive capabilities.
It'll probably be one of the more shorter term, I think, impacts.
Yeah.
Like the deepfake examples are, I think, very, very obvious to people, and it's not entirely unimaginable to see something major actually happening there, like whether it's impersonating speech or impersonating messaging. And now that the majority of political campaigns are communicated via media, and if anybody's read Life 3.0, I think there's an interesting thought experiment that runs there in the first chapter. So to the extent that cyber actually melds with media to morph communication and messaging at scale, I would say that's a very near-term issue.
And then there was a really interesting question about is kind of fundamentally, can you keep this in the box, and how do you think about that? And I think, I mean, there's this beautiful moment in the Richard Rhodes book on the making of the atomic bomb, where he talks about how Niels Bohr had the literature that he'd fallen in love with as a child had given him this idea of complementarity, which is how there's always a sort of two sides to a thing, and he has this moment when he simultaneously conceives of the destructive potential of the atomic bomb and then simultaneously conceives of the fact that it will lead to the end of mass war, because once it proliferates, you can't have mass war in the same way. And so I think it's a very interesting philosophical debate I think we should be having more of about whether we want to, as aggressively as possible, proliferate everything going on here rather than see it become siloed as a means to secure peace, or whether that will be destructive. It's a complex topic.
That sounds like a fabulous way to end the panel. But before I do, let me ask, I mean, insofar as it's sort of a way of taking the AI research and bringing it to these larger trends that we're facing in our day. Nathan, is there anything you'd like to add?
Please check out the report and tell us what we've missed out on. I think it's impossible to survey the entire landscape. I think there's also some outstanding questions that we have in here with missing data, and I'm sure that if we were to crowdsource everybody's opinion on it, we'd make it even better. So definitely encourage you to ping us. It's definitely a mixtape. It's not a complete album.
Great, good. Thanks a lot. Join me in thanking the panel.